I wanted to do a third part on the tribe of Asher being in the Americas, as even though I did two parts explaining my reasoning, I had somebody write me a comment on another YouTube channel's community post informing me that the tribe of Asher was in Africa. This would be problematic for many reasons, seeing as all 12 tribes would receive salvation together out of Asherith or the land of the north. And if they believe that location is in Africa, then theoretically we would have another captivity to go through, according to prophecy. So we'll go back to the prophecy to show other indications that Asherith is in the Americas. Then I'll also use DNA evidence to show where natives and South Americans migrated from. I'll start with the names of Asher's sons. We know that the name of Asher foretold this tribe being the happiest people on earth, but we get a clue of another foretelling of their future through the names of four of his sons. Looking at 1 Chronicles chapter 7, we see they have names related to being hidden. You can see all the names from verses 30 going down to 39, but I want to focus on four of them in particular. First, we have the name Yehuba, which means hidden, and that's Strong's Hebrew 3160. Then we have the name Shamar, it means to be preserved, and that's Strong's Hebrew 8105. Then we have Pasak, which means to cut off or divide, and that's Strong's Hebrew 6457. And finally, we have Pispa, which means disappearance, which is Strong's Hebrew 6462 and 6461. This is a foretelling of the uncontacted tribes of Brazil. The vast majority of uncontacted tribes in the world are located in the Amazon, showing more evidence that the Americas is Asherith that the Bible speaks of. Next, if you remember, I used Revelation 7 to show Asher and Naphtali would be geographically linked. We read that in Revelation 7, verse 6. Of the tribe of Asher was sealed 12,000. Of the tribe of Naphtali was sealed 12,000. Then we went to Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 23, where we understood that they would possess the west and the south. And of Naphtali he said, O Naphtali, satisfied with favor and full with the blessing of the Lord, possess thou the west and the south. And then used Judges chapter 5 to show that they lived at high altitudes, and that's in verse 18. Zebulun and Naphtali were a people that jeoparded their lives unto the death in the high places of the field. I used these scriptures to demonstrate that this was referring to the Andes Mountains range. Looking at a map, I don't think there's any other mountain range on any landmass that occupies the west and the south. West Africa doesn't have vast mountain ranges. But I should just show that the prophecy in Genesis for Naphtali is in line with this prophecy as well. We'll go to Genesis 49 and I'll read verse 21. Naphtali is a hind let loose, he giveth goodly words. A hind is a female red deer who occupy the mountains. We can also take a look at the Inca Empire who occupied the Andes. We can see that they used to fight from the mountaintops, rolling rocks down on their opponents, taking advantage of the hilly terrain. So just as in Judges, they jeoparded themselves in the high places of the field. So now we'll go back to Deuteronomy 33, verse 17, where it's referring to Ephraim, the head tribe of the northern kingdom. His glory is like the firstling of his bullock, and his horns are like the horns of unicorns. With them he shall push the people together to the ends of the earth, and they are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh. So the people, or we can refer to them as the northern kingdom, will be pushed to the ends of the earth. If we look at a book called Latino and Hispanic History by Michael Norick, we can see that the name for Chile in Mapuche translates as where the land ends or the deepest part of the earth. More evidence America being the biblical Asherith. So back in Deuteronomy 33, we'll read verse 28 now. Israel then shall dwell in safety alone. The fountain of Jacob shall be upon a land of corn and wine. Also his heavens shall drop down dew. So here it's letting us know that the Northern Kingdom would dwell in safety alone. The only place on Earth in history that this could possibly be would be the Americas before the Europeans arrived. Now I'll link everything that I've just said to DNA evidence. But first I'll read 2nd Edras, a few verses in 2nd Edras chapter 13 again. I'll start at verse 40. Those are the 10 tribes which were carried away prisoners out of their own land in the time of Hosea the king, who Salmanassar the king of Assyria led away captive, and he carried them over the waters, and so came they into another land. Verse 41. But they took this counsel among themselves, that they would leave the multitude of the heathen and go forth into a further country where never mankind dwelt. And I'll just skip down to verse 45. For through that country there was a great way to go, namely of a year and a half, and the same region is called Asherith. So we can see that Asherith was a land that was not previously populated. We know that the Americas were first populated by the Y chromosome haplogroup Q. We are dealing with male lineages, as the Bible recognizes paternal lineages. I'll just get that quickly. We'll go to Numbers chapter 1 verse 18. And they assembled all the congregation together on the first day of the 2nd month, and they declared their pedigrees after their families by the house of their fathers, according to the number of the names from 20 years old and upward, by their polls. We see this repeated in the book of Ezra, chapter 2 and verse 59. And these were they which went up from Telhassa, Cherub, Adan, and Immer, but they could not show their father's house and their seed, whether they were of Israel. So biblical lineages are determined through the paternal line. So I'll briefly explain what a haplogroup is and what it isn't without getting too technical. A haplogroup is a population that grew large enough where the group as a whole took on characteristics that we can identify in DNA. This does not necessarily mean that the haplogroup represents a pure ethnicity, just that the group as a whole display one or more traits common to that population. I'll give a brief hypothetical. Let's say we have a new virus break out in the UK, like COVID-23 or something. And because we've learned lessons from previous COVID, the UK was isolated from the rest of the world. The virus would spread through the nation, and those that survive would have some degree of immunity to the virus. So even though the UK has a mostly white demographic, we would recognize that the general population is made up of different ethnicities. Therefore, the UK as a whole would have genetic differences to the other populations of the earth, while not basically or being a group of pure ethnicity. So now let's go back to 2nd Esdras chapter 13 with this understanding. 2nd Esdras 13, I'm going to read 40 and 41 again. Those are the 10 tribes which were carried away prisoner out of their own land in the time of Hosea the king of Israel, whom Salmanassar the king of Assyria led away captive, and he carried them over the waters, and so they came into another land. But they took counsel among themselves that they would leave the multitude of the heathen and go forth into a further country where never mankind dwelt. So we see here that they came out of a population that was mixed with the heathen. We know exactly where that was by looking at 2 Kings 17, and I'll read verse 6. In the 9th year of Hosea, who is the king of Israel, the king of Assyria took Samaria, and he carried Israel away into Assyria, and placed them in Halah and in Habor by the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. And sometimes that reads mountains of the Medes. So what we can use haplogroups for is to trace the migration pattern of these people, who were the first people to occupy the uninhabited land of America. And as we can see, the population or haplogroup Q originated exactly where the Bible says they were, mixed with the multitude of the heathen. They were relocated in 722 BC, and probably didn't gain independence until 612 BC, which means they probably spent about 4 generations amongst the heathen building that population group. It's interesting to note that if they did indeed take advantage of the rebellion against the Assyrians at the Battle of Nineveh to escape, then tradition tells us through Diodorus that there was a flooding at the time of this battle, which again reminds me of 2nd Edras chapter 13, and I'll read verses 43 and 44. And they entered into the Euphrates by the narrow places of the river. For the Most High then showed signs for them and held still the flood till they were passed over. So if the narrow passages relate to where the Euphrates ends, and there were floods around the region of the Black Sea, perhaps this is where they would have begun their journey. So we can say for certain the people who first settled in the Americas originate from the exact place the Bible said the Northern Kingdom would be placed. Now, the conventional way to look at the length of time of this migration would suggest that this happened over tens of thousands of years, but this would rely on the molecular clock dating and phylogeny to come to this conclusion. I could go into why we cannot rely on either, but I'd rather not go into explaining statistical models or the problems with mapping phylogeny onto biblical genealogies. Perhaps in a part 4 if there's interested. But basically, if you are using haplogroups for anything more than to trace the migration of that population group, and I don't mean ethnicity, then you are going to run into irreconcilable differences with the Bible, no matter who you identify as. At that point, you basically have to pick a side. Either the word of God is true or the current scientific consensus. So I'll finish this here. I hope this gives more insight into why I say the Americas is the biblical location of Assyria. I've done 3 parts now, and I hope that you've been able to follow my line of thinking. Maybe I'll do a part 4 explaining the issue of utilizing the molecular clock to date haplogroups or using phylogeny to suggest parent-child relationships between haplogroups, but only if there's interest. Technically, we've only really looked at Ezra, Jeremiah, and John in Revelation to show the restoration of the Northern Kingdom and Southern Kingdom. I could also look at Isaiah or Ezekiel, but we'll see how I feel next. So yeah, that's it. All praises to the Most High.